small Aboriginal communities. The dog there, I just put that in for fun. But one of the a radio station from Cairns called Bulma Bipra, and there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen you can see them. They're doing an outside broadcast from a cultural festival at this place called Laura on Cape York Peninsula. Radio Larrakia and Bachelor College. Bachelor College is a college which trains Indigenous people in media schools, journalism and media schools. There are hundreds of graduates who come from Bachelor College who work in their communities around Australia, but unfortunately there is no career path for all of these graduates. Hundreds of graduates who can operate a radio microphone, who can conduct interviews and do all sorts of things as well as you or I, those who work in the industry, and yet there is no career path for these young people. It's a really sad situation which really has to be remedied. This was at the Garma Cultural Festival in the Northern Territory, and here you can see on the top right a group of schoolgirls learning how to use community radio, a local Aboriginal community radio station there, and on the left Frank Gumawinku. Frank's one of the oldest broadcasters from one of the islands, from the Tiwi Islands, north of Australia. He broadcasts, so you get old people and young people together, working in radio, working together. In the Central Desert, the Arnagu, Pitjantjatjara, Yankajara people have very active media. This was a group of people who were attending a cultural festival. We attended to conduct interviews with local people during our audience study. And you can see the symbols there. This is something which has a lot in common, I think, with Indigenous people around the world. The symbols are very, very important in describing how messages and how media, how communication takes place. In Central Australia, the Walbury and the Pintabee and the Armatura people, you can see that diagram on the bottom right. That is essentially a map of the Indigenous connections, media connections in Central Australia. And you can see there that that central location is one of the major communities, and all of the smaller communities are linked in some way through satellite navigation. This was part of the work we had to do in gathering information for our audience study. We had to drive thousands of kilometres along dirt roads like this, and talking to people, interviewing people on radio, and it really was a most incredible experience for me, but it makes you realise not only how big Australia is, but how diverse Indigenous communities are around the country. And I think this is one thing which all Indigenous people share globally, that tend to be talked about under one heading, but of course there is extreme diversity in Taiwan. All of the different tribal groups in Taiwan have their own cultures, their own special interests, their own ceremonies, their own rituals. It's the same with Indigenous people everywhere. They are not the same. They are different, they are diverse, but I guess they are unified in terms of their political struggle for recognition. Here you can see in the artwork from South Australia, Umiwara media, these three women, Aboriginal women, very different from the women we saw in some of the Central Australian images there. But they identify as Indigenous, and they produce Indigenous programs for local audiences, including a program that goes into prisons. There are several programs that deal with prisoners, because Aboriginal prisoners tend to be, Aboriginal people tend to be imprisoned at something like 20 times the rate of non-Aboriginal people in Australia. So a lot of Aboriginal people in prison, and the community media provides programs for those prisoners so that they can connect with their families, they can read letters from their families, and hopefully maintain some kind of a link. Okay, so that was just a bit of a quick whiz around the big country there. Oops, sorry. So just a few comments about Indigenous media policy before I just move on to the case study to finish. Indigenous media policy has always been marginalised. Like, as I said before, third sector policies generally tend to be pushed aside. They're not very important. They don't think it matters very much to people, policymakers. In Australia, obscured by 50,000 years of difference. I could probably also add there that you could maybe even say 50,000 years of indifference, because governments really have been totally indifferent to Indigenous people for so long that the policy environment is almost ignores Indigenous people altogether. Governments too have a preference for the hard research data. They want to know how many people are listening to the radio, how many people are watching, rather than what impact is media having on communities? Why do people watch? How do they watch? Those kind of qualitative questions tend to be pushed aside more for the quantitative data, which is extremely difficult to gather in Indigenous communities. You know, you can't just walk into an Indigenous community and say, "Hi, I'm here to do a survey. Can you fill this in, please?" Most people will say, "Well, we don't want to talk to you because who are you? You know, where do you come from? Where's this information going to be used?" Too many academics have taken information from Indigenous communities in the past, and Indigenous people now are very, very cautious about letting researchers into their communities, and they should be, because so much information has been taken away and so little benefits have flowed back to the communities that the communities say, "Well, why should we talk to another researcher?" So I think any kind of research in this area really has to establish strong cultural links well before you can set foot in a community. For example, in our audience study, it took me 18 months before I made the first community visit to ask questions, because it took me that long to reassure the communities, even though I'd worked with them for many years. They wanted to know what was going to happen with the data. How was it going to benefit them? Why should they speak to yet another researcher, even though it was me, who many of you knew? It took 18 months before I made the first visit to collect data from the communities. And that was crucial because it established that I was genuine, that I wanted to give something back to those communities rather than take it away. So it's a very slow process, but very, very important. And I think the message here is that policymakers really need to shift their thinking and take into account this idea of sense of values rather than just looking at statistical printouts of the numbers of people watching and listening to programs. I've said before that Indigenous media has evolved in a policy vacuum, and there's still no recognition of Indigenous languages and culture in the Australian Broadcasting Services Act. New Zealand managed to do it in 1989, Canada in 1968, and here we are, 2013, and Australia still does not acknowledge Indigenous languages and cultures in its Broadcasting Act, which I think is shocking, actually a shocking thing to happen. The first Indigenous policy wasn't until 1993, and yet Indigenous people have been producing their own media for, you could argue, maybe 50,000 years, but even in the last 200, using more advanced technologies, people have been working on these kinds of things. I'll just go through this. I'm approaching my time, so don't want to take up Volker's time there, so I'll be careful in what I do here. This is just a summary of the first Indigenous community television broadcast began in 2002, and so really ICTV, and if you Google ICTV, you will find a very innovative, fantastic Indigenous community organisation which pioneered Indigenous television in Australia. Unfortunately, the government decided that there would be only one television channel available in Australia, and it decided that NITV, a National Indigenous Television Service, would be the channel. Indigenous people in the bush, in the remote areas, said that unless we can have our voices and our faces on that screen, that's no good for us. The people who produce television in the city are producing different kinds of images. They're not our children, they're not our people up there. And so there was a disagreement over that. The government decided that there would be one channel, and NITV was launched in 2007. So the pioneer of Indigenous TV really was pushed aside. Negotiations continued, but fell down, they broke down. NITV would not accept a lot of the programming that was produced by the ICTV, the bush, the remote communities. They said it's not a broadcast quality, it's not good enough, audiences won't understand it because it was in language. All of these things that people who saw it before seemed to be able to accept. And so there was some problem there. Fortunately, at the end of last year, ICTV managed to launch on a digital channel in Australia after about waiting for 3 years, being off the air. And also NITV, which was struggling financially, has moved to join the public service broadcast and the special broadcasting service at the same time. So now the Indigenous TV channel in Australia, NITV, is part of the public broadcasting system. So exactly the opposite of what's happening here in Taiwan, with TITV becoming independent next year, moving away from the public broadcasting system. In Australia, it's gone the opposite way, which I don't think is not necessarily a good thing. But the advantage there is that ICTV remains as an independent television service servicing those remote communities with different languages in the bush areas. So I think now we finally have a good result. The only problem is that I live in Brisbane, in a city. I can't see ICTV. There's no way that I can watch it because I have to have a satellite television dish and I have to have a decoder to pull the signal down. So the only people who can watch this innovative ICTV, which I think is the most innovative television channel in the country, is to move out to a remote area and get a satellite dish. We cannot see it in the capital cities. And I think that's a real problem for Australian policymakers. Everyone in Australia needs to see it. In fact, during our audience study, one of the white workers, she was working at one of the shops in a remote Aboriginal community in Western Australia. And she said to me, if everyone in Australia could see this channel, it would change people's attitudes about Indigenous people overnight. And I think she's got a point. Here are just some of the supporting, this is how much money is devoted. I'm not sure the TITV figures may be out of date now, but they were the latest ones I could get. But you can see from that, I tried to, in the New Taiwan dollars, just to give you an idea of the levels of support. But you can see there that Australia is way behind Canada, way behind New Zealand in support for Indigenous television. The TITV figures, I'm sure someone could maybe correct me if that's wrong, but they're the figures I could get in 2006. 300, so that's too much. That's exaggerated. 300 million for TITV, so in many ways TITV is worse off than NITV in Australia. And I think realistically, how can you expect a television service to be produced for what amounts to just small change? It's almost like a token gesture, saying, oh, we're happy to spend millions of dollars on our public broadcasting service, but here's just a bit of money left over for the Indigenous communication sector. You can do what you like with that. It's like giving, I liken it, like giving a pack of hungry dogs just one bone. Of course they're going to fight over it, and so I think that's not so good. Okay, so just summing up some of the main points here. We have to acknowledge that tensions still remain between Indigenous communities in the bush and the remote areas. That's something I'm sure that exists everywhere. But Indigenous radio and television have become the central organising elements of societies where they are active, where those community media things are active. They're very, very much in demand. So it's led to some creative uses and innovative uses of ICT, so I think that's something which has been very, very good. It provides a cultural bridge, I think, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and has helped to break down some of the stereotypes that dominate mainstream media coverage of Indigenous people. Very, very importantly though, the Indigenous media sector has enabled these communities to experience empowerment. So what about the future? We need to recognise there are multiple perspectives on these issues, and I think the communities themselves have to be more aware of the political game if they want to get policy changes that are going to affect them. And it means that the communities themselves have to have some help probably in meeting some of these policy dilemmas that are very, very difficult to negotiate. All parties need to be able to disagree and experiment. If we're just insisting on people using particular ways of media, we're going to get the same, or we're going to get failures. If the communities are allowed to experiment and try out different ways, maybe everybody can learn from past experiences in that way. Multi-stakeholder negotiation rather than governments coming in and saying, this is what you will do.